Okay, so welcome back to the IFES SSRC Academic Writing Workshop on International Publication. I am Firman and I will lead today's session as usual with our amazing speakers. And this is the fourth and final day of the public workshop. And we appreciate everyone who has taken time to learn with us here. And we sincerely hope that these materials are a resource for extending your research and writing to international audiences. Today, we will start with a Q&A discussion session with Linda Grove on preparing literature review. We hope you all had a chance to watch the videos ahead of time. We will go ahead and drop the links into the chat one more time so you can watch it at a later time. But as usual, before we begin, I would like to outline a few logistical details for the webinar. So the same with the past 3 days, we kindly ask that you direct your questions by typing them into the Q&A feature. The Q&A feature of the webinar can be found below your screen. I believe it's next to the raise hand button. And also please don't forget to include your name and institution to let us know where you are coming from. All right, so without further ado, let me welcome Linda to share some brief introductory remarks on her recorded materials before we open up for question and discussion. Linda?
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm coming to you from Gifu, Japan, which is last night. We had a big earthquake in Japan. Fortunately, there doesn't seem to have been too much human damage, although the trains that go up from Tokyo up into northeast Japan had a major derailing and are not going to be back in operation probably for several weeks or something like that. I trust there will not be any aftershocks tonight while we're talking. So the presentation that has been recorded and that you can look at, hopefully you've already looked at it, but we can look at your leisure, is about making literature surveys. I want to just say a few very brief things about a literature survey. Most of what I wanted to say is, in fact, in the recording. Whenever you do a research project of whatever scale or size, you all usually start with a research survey on your own, basically to find out what other people have said, since there's not much point in going out and redoing something that somebody's already done very thoroughly from the same perspective and using similar data. So when you do the research yourself, you have to go through doing a research survey, try to find out what's there, what has been done. And while you're doing that, then you think of things that haven't been what we call, you become aware of what we call the research gap. This is one of the things you do a research survey for. You may also pick up ideas about how other people have approached the problem or the question that you're interested in. And you may want to learn from them, or you may want to say, hey, I don't think that's right, and I want to do something else. And when you come to write, after you've done this research project, you then want to sort of use the literature survey to help you frame your argument. And in the presentation and with the materials that go along with it, I've given you a number of examples of different ways of doing that. There are very straightforward ways of doing it, and there are less straightforward ways. What you don't want to do is to sort of have the whole first part of the article you're writing just a kind of repetition describing what other people have done. Quite frankly, if you do a couple paragraphs of that, people will stop reading and they aren't going to go on to find out what you have to say. So you need to find more subtle ways of using the material that you've gotten from the literature survey in framing and shaping your article. And that's what basically the presentation tries to give you ideas about, how to go about doing that. And there are a number of examples. There are different ways. It depends in part, of course, on the field you're in and the approach you're taking. it depends on, how you're setting up your article. If you say, well, other people have looked at this problem from the perspective of A, and I'm going to look at it from the perspective of B, which nobody has done, you're going to just make a few references to what has already been done. You don't need lots of them. You don't need detailed descriptions of the article. You want to work it in very quickly so that the reader doesn't get stuck on other people's work. There are other ways of doing it. One of the examples I gave you, in fact, came from somebody who attended one of these workshops a couple of years ago, who was interested in the problem of workers, young women workers in a Chinese factory, believing that they saw ghosts. And she, in fact, starts first with her kind of anthropological account of what she has, and then brings up the literature about how other people have dealt with this and what she's going to do. But there are many ways of doing it. If you look at the examples, you will see. And if you become sensitized to the subject, every time you read an article, you can say, okay, how is this person doing a literature survey? How are they using what other people have said? And how have they worked it in to their presentation so that it doesn't dominate it or sort of go on for too long and people lose interest? So why don't I stop there and see what kind of questions you have? We hope you have some questions.
Thank you very much, Linda. Yeah, so again, I still haven't got any question yet. Oh, there you go. All right, so yeah, once again, for all the participants, if you have any question, please feel free to do so. So we have the first question here, Linda. I will read it for you.
Okay.
So this is from Rampu. So he is the doctoral student in ITB, Indonesia. I am still preparing a literature review, discontinued for time being. The topic is about evolution in transportation demand modeling, as presented in attached slide. The main reason of discontinuation is not enough judgment, how to limit. Enough is enough on literature survey and the sources and how to frame it. Please give me some advice. Thank you very much.
Okay, there's sort of two parts of advice on this. The first part is, in fact, what you may want to put in your dissertation. And in the dissertation, in fact, you do have to prove to your mentor and to the people on your committee that you know what you're doing. And so it is the custom in almost all fields in the dissertation itself, often to have a whole chapter on a literature survey. And it's basically to show the members of your committee, who are the only people who probably will ever read that chapter, that you know what you're doing, that you've read all the major works, and that you've taken that into account when you're doing your own thesis. When you come to publish that, however, nobody else wants to read. You've already, once you've gotten the degree, you've proved that you've got the qualifications to write and do independent research, and you no longer have to prove that to people. So once you've gotten past putting everything into the dissertation to show them, yeah, see, I read it all, then you can sort of take a step back, and when you want to go toward publication, say, okay, what part of this literature survey I've done, which has probably, I don't know how many citations it would be in your field. In some fields, you'd have, 50 citations or something. What part of that do I actually need to explain the background or the approach I'm taking in a specific article that I'm writing? So you only need to pull out the most important part. And it's best in most cases not to say, and as we know, XX person said this, and Y person said this, and Z person said this. It's better if you can talk about the concepts, for example. So you're talking about transportation, evolution of transportation, and you might say, well, X person, there are three different views of how transportation has evolved. This is just my sort of imagination right now, and the first one looks at it this way, and then just put in parentheses the title and the author's name and date. The second one looks at it this way, the third one that way. And so you're setting up and framing your article using material from the literature survey that talks about how people have done it before, but without going into long descriptions of what each of the authors has said. As I said, for the dissertation, you do need to put everything in there, and your advisors will undoubtedly look to see if you've missed anything important. But when you come to presenting it to a more general audience, we're going to all assume you know what you're doing. And so you want to tell us what is only most essential. I hope that helps some.
All right, thank you, Linda. So yeah, we have to differentiate between the dissertation and publication. Mainly,
Yeah,
right?
the dissertation, there's no question you have to put it all in.
Exactly. All right. Okay. So yeah, regarding the concept, by the way, I have an extension to that question, because I was actually the one who did it incorrectly, because at first during my undergrad, like decades back ago, I wrote with the author and not the concept, just like what you say and what Paul Kritiska said before. So, but yeah, in terms of the concept, do you think we should go with the general idea first and then getting narrower and narrower in terms of the variables of the concept? Or
I mean, part of it is a question of personal style. I always try to keep it to a minimum. This is not to say that I don't think other people have done very important things. And it depends also on the topic you're doing. I mean, if it's a topic in which there are major schools who disagree with each other about how terms ought to be used or how you ought to deal with a particular subject, you're going to deal with that in a different way than you'll deal with something where, for example, one of the articles I gave you is one that I wrote myself a couple of years ago on prostitution in a small North China town. You know, and it was a pretty straightforward matter because all of the literature in the major languages I know, English, Chinese, and Japanese, about prostitution in China is about big cities. And I had happened to come across materials that allowed me to write about the issue in a town that has only 15,000 people. And so, you know, it was pretty straightforward. You say, well, there's all this stuff on the big cities, and this is going to look at what happens in small towns. And so give a few references to what's going on in the big cities. And then later on in the article, when specific issues came up, you can introduce things. You don't have to put everything, all the background reading in the first paragraph or two. You can introduce it in later parts when it becomes crucial to the argument you're making, or to differentiate what you're saying from what other people have said.
okay, thank you, Linda.
Okay.
So yeah, the saying, the more the better is not always correct, right?
The more the better is not always correct unless it's your dissertation.
All right, so I have the second question here. This is regarding tips. So do you have any tips in organizing ideas for preparing the literature review before writing? Do you make an outline or a mind map to help you organize your ideas? This is from Avanti.
I used to. What I do now sometimes is sit down and write sort of little short paragraphs of ideas and then sort of switch them around, but I'm not sure that will work for everyone. I'm working on an essay now for a collective project on cultural history of China, where I'm supposed to be writing about 150 years of Chinese agriculture. And I ended up sitting down, having read a number and reviewed a number of sources, with writing kind of short paragraphs on the things that I wanted to talk about, and then trying to figure out where to put them. I do think you need to sit down and figure out what you want, how you want to frame the article. And where the literature survey, where the earlier research is going to fit in that framing, either in concepts or in approaches or in kinds of data, so that you have some idea of where that all is going to fit. Some people are able to get everything worked out at the very beginning and then just write straight through. Other people you start writing parts of it that work better, and you may then want to go back and redo the framing. That maybe is not a very helpful answer. I think there are so many different personal writing styles.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So it all depends on the style. So we have a question from Elizabeth asking about terms. So yeah, basically, what is the difference between conceptual review and literature review? Can you give examples?
I'm not sure. I think I mean, when you talk about a conceptual review, reviewing the concepts that people in your field have used to discuss the kind of problem that you want to do. And that's inevitably going to be tied together with a literature survey. I mean, you're going to be looking at the work of specific scholars and trying to figure out a kind of genealogy, or figure out how the use of terms has maybe changed over time, has evolved over time. So I'm not sure. I think they're terribly different, that it's basically a matter of choice which you want to use. That maybe not be very helpful, but that's the best I can do right now.
No worries. Thank you very much. So next up is from Yahya from UGM. Thank you for the insightful material. He would like to ask your opinion on how deep or specific the literature review should be.
Well, again, I mean, the first thing is dissertations aside, right? So we put dissertations aside. In a short article, you've got what, maybe somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 words to explain and develop the ideas that you want people to read and to take home with them. And you don't want them so distracted from a long discussion of what has already been said that they're weary before they get to what you want to say. So remember that what you want to say is the heart of the article, and the references to other literature are to help explain what other people have said before, or to frame what you're doing, all the things that my colleagues have been talking to you about, how you have to explain, what is your contribution, what is new about this. I always think the thing that you want to think about is, if somebody just read your article, what do you want them to take away from it? What do you want them to remember about what you had to say? If they give them maybe 10 or 15, not 10, say 2 paragraphs to say what was important about your article, and you want to be sure that that comes across, and you don't want too much discussion of what other people have said to mess that up, to sort of cause confusion about where you are. So you need enough to show what you're doing is different from what other people have done, or how it's developing on things that others have done, but taking it in a new direction. So you want it just enough to frame effectively. I think that's about it, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because I think, based on my opinion, I think it's, rather than having too much concept, but delve on that on the surface level, we might have to pick some of the main ideas that could represent our research in a better way, right? That's why we have to be concise, just like what Linda told us. Okay, so the next question, we have a question. Can we publish our literature review as a review chapter if our literature review is significant enough related to history and data where it can stand alone? Do you think any journal will consider to accept it? Thank you.
The answer to that is yes. There is a whole genre of writing, of essays that are usually referred to as surveys of a field, in which someone will undertake to give a kind of overview of how arguments in a particular field have developed. Not too long ago, I wrote one for the International Journal of Asian Studies, which is edited at Tokyo University and published by Cambridge University Press. And it was on I work on China, on rural history in China, and there had a group of Japanese scholars in the 1940s had done a series of very famous books on Chinese village organization. And there has been a whole tradition in the last 20 or 30 years of people going back to the same villages and doing follow-up studies. And I did a review article on those follow-up studies. And yes, the journal was more than happy to publish it. Many, I know mostly the sort of Asian studies and historical journals, they often will do this. Now, sometimes you can ask the editor if they're interested in something like that. Sometimes the editors will go to a specific scholar and ask them to write a survey of the field. So that there is a kind of genre of writing of what is a kind of very sophisticated version of a literature survey, in which the ideas in a particular field or toward a particular problem have developed over some period of time, and there's been some interesting, both theoretical and other literature coming out of that. And yes, those things can be published and are published. And as for all of us, they're also very useful if you want to get a quick sort of overview of what's going on in a particular field. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. The next question is from Poppy. She thanked you for the handout. She very enjoyed reading the paper on ghost in China factory. So the question is, so the literature review is commonly written in the introduction. Does the introduction also contain the result of our research, or should it be only just about literature research from other people's studies? So yeah, basically the question is whether we should reveal our answer on the first part of the literature, first part of our research or paper, or should we wait for to reveal it on the second half of the paper?
This is again a kind of part of personal style. I included, in fact, the one with the ghost story because it seemed to me that it gave you a model for how things are often done, particularly by anthropologists or people who have done some kind of field work where they have stories that come out of the field work and they use those to draw in. I think when someone starts reading the one with the ghost story, it's very hard to put it down. You want to see what's going to happen. And so it draws you into the material. Obviously, in other fields, that's not the way you write. If you're doing quantitative research or if you're doing various other kinds of research, you wouldn't do it that way. Should you put the answer there? I mean, in most cases, the major claim that you want to make in the article, the major argument you want to make, is certainly going to be laid out in the abstract. And often people are going to read the abstract before they go on to read the article, so they're going to know where you're going anyway. Do you put it in the very beginning? Well, you should at least let people know what the question is that you're working on. Whether you give all the answers in the very beginning, I think that's a matter of how you want to develop the article of style. But you certainly want to make it clear to the readers what the question is you're working on. And unless you've got one of these, something like that kind of ghost story style, it may be a good idea to also at least offer clear direction about where you're going. And it certainly will hint at the answer that you're going to give. Okay.
Thank
Next.
you very much. All right, so I'm going to go with the question from Beche first. This is Beche from Unibus Makassar. So mainly he asked about what do we have to do if we don't have access to international journal databases like JSTOR, ProQuest, and etc. because some of many academicians at the moment do not really have access, because most of the institutions don't have partnership, and so forth, right? So they rely on some free database such as Google Scholar. So what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, this is a problem that I spend a lot of time worrying about. The universities that are very rich, or the research institutes that are very rich, subscribe to unusually large numbers of databases. In my field, there are many that are for Chinese studies that are made in China and that cost a lot of money. And there's very unequal access to them. And it's not good. I mean, I do think that one way around that is Google Scholar. It will give you references, and sometimes there will be a link that you don't have to have paid for it. I don't know what the custom is in Indonesia. In Japan now, for example, most universities have set up university depositories, and people can put their articles in the university depository. You can't put the final published version, but you can put the one, what I think Paul Kratoskis officially calls the preprint version. You can put that in without violating copyright. And so I think if you search, Google Scholar is one way to do it, to try to find that. Another way to do it is to, if you can search on Google and figure out where the scholar is. Often if you go to their university's website, if they've posted a CV, there will be links in the CV to articles that are not covered by the paid for only databases. It's a real problem, and that's the best that unfortunately I can do now. I wish personally that there were much more open access publishing, that there was a kind of fair playing field so everybody had equal access, but I think we're a long way from that, unfortunately. Okay, what should we do next?
Linda. Okay, so yeah, the questions keep coming. So the next question is from Lucia. I think this is the correlation with the previous questions. So Linda, may I ask on how we should limit the criteria of the references that we will use, so that we will not be overwhelmed on putting too many references in literature review? So how much is too many, according to you?
I mean, I think you probably don't want more than 4 or 5 in your framing place, unless you want to say something. I mean, there are ways around this, so you can do it. So you can show that you've read things, or you've referred to things without it. So you can say, there are many studies on, we'll go back to our railroads, on the evolution and development of railroads in Indonesia. And then you can put in parentheses just author, date. And if you do that without going into what each of them said, you make the references relatively concrete and fast. If you're going to put in references that you're actually going to talk about in a little more detail because they're important for framing, you are going to have to say something like, I'm going to be using the word evolution in transport. I don't know if that's a word or a concept or not, but I'm going to be using evolution in transport in ways very similar to those used by scholar XX. He differentiates this term from the way scholar YY uses it, who uses it this way. I mean, something like that. But you don't want to, if you have them in parentheses or in a footnote where you're just going to have citations, it's not going to distract too much. It's when you try to describe them all in the text that it gets very hard for the reader to follow. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. So yeah, because we have limited time, maybe I can ask you 2 or 3 more questions before we are moving on to Paul, because I believe Paul is here at the moment. So the next question is more practical. suggestion. So this is from Harvia, from Bryn. So I'm writing on how violent governmentality results in structural violence. Should I write literature review on the relation between governmentality and violence? Could I review only on governmentality? Because that is what I did in my last article.
I mean, without reading this, it's a little hard to give very practical advice, but if in fact the paper you're writing is centered on governmentality, then you can do only that. One of the questions is how much the violence part is part of the framing of what you want to say. You want the literature survey, the elements of that you work into your argument to focus on the crucial analytical issues you're trying to get at. And if the analytical issue is in fact governmentality, then that's what you want to focus on. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Linda. So the next question is from Hasni, from Al Muslim University Aceh. I'm writing the contents of a chapter for a journal. In my dissertation, I write about my own interpretation, while journals have a different structure. So how to bring chapter writing to the journal? Do all the contents in the writing procedure have to be changed?
This is a slightly tricky question to answer, in the sense that part of it depends on what function the chapters of your dissertation had and whether they can stand alone. And sometimes they can stand alone and sometimes they can't. Sometimes they can more or less stand alone as they are with just a little reframing. Often, however, you need to figure out a way to put in some crucial background that will help the reader place what you're talking about. I mean, in most dissertations, you start with your introduction, which lays out the big ideas, and then you have a series of chapters. You probably have a literature survey chapter, and then you have a series of chapters that develop specific parts of the argument. And one of the questions is whether there's enough background in the chapter as it exists now for somebody outside to know why this is important, or what it is, how it fits with some important argument. And so you want to be sure you have that. You also, quite frankly, if you intend to publish a book out of your dissertation, you don't want to publish too many chapters separately, because then publishers may not want to publish the book. They may think it's already out there, so why should they bother? One strategy is, in fact, to take the chapters that are least crucial to your argument and to find a way to publish those as independent articles. I guess that's about what I have to say, I think.
All right, thank you, Linda. So I have one last question before we finish our session with you today. So this is from Fiennes Rumata from Bryn. Most of my writing is about practical and policy matter. For example, the internet governance in Indonesia. In the literature review section, I discuss mostly about policy matter rather than the theoretical one. So in order to increase my paper's publishable value, is there any weight composition between the policy and the practical theoretical discussion?
I think this is going to depend very much on the journals that you're targeting. I would urge you to take a look, to sort of figure out what journals you might want to apply to, you might want to submit to, and then read very quickly through several issues to see what style people use. I think there are policy journals, or journals that are primarily interested in policy, that are not going to worry much about the theoretical arguments or the theoretical background, that are going to be much more interested in what you've actually done and what the policy implications of it are. If you're trying to transition from that to a journal, a more sort of general, not policy-oriented journal, then you probably do need to at least have some discussion of the theoretical propositions behind the kind of work you're doing. But my guess is that, in fact, the policy research is also looking at practical problems, and it is going to have some kind of theoretical founding, theoretical basis for the kinds of questions and approaches you've done, and you may want to talk about that. But I'd urge you first to figure out what journal you want to target, and before you spend a lot of time rewriting it in a different way, see in fact what style is chosen in the journals that you're interested in. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Linda, for your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
For all of your elaboration.
If there are further questions, just send them along in email, and I will try to send back answers in a day or two.
Definitely. Okay. So yeah, once again, thank you very much, Linda, for your insightful presentation and elaboration. I'm sure that all the participants are now more familiar in not only producing a literature review, but how to produce a good literature review.
Okay, thank you
very much. Right. Please, everybody, give a big round of applause for Linda. We will now move on to our second speaker for today. We have Paul Kratoska joining us today. Hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm fine today. Thank you very much.
All right. So yeah, on this session, we will have Paul Kratoska discussing about several things, getting published, scholarly ethics, and also, I believe, about the current trends in academic publishing, right? So yeah, without further ado, I would like to share my screen with Paul. Paul?
Okay, well, before we get started, I'd like to add a couple of things to what Linda was saying. One of them, this question about access to journals. I don't know much about this, but I have read somewhere that some libraries still do a kind of an interlibrary loan only with digital materials. So it would be worth finding out if your university has some kind of an arrangement that might give you access to material in that way. And then the question about publishing chapters from a dissertation. Okay, putting on my hat as a book publisher, the general rule is that publishing one chapter, not as is in the dissertation, because you have to position, it has to be a standalone article, but publishing one chapter is a very good thing if you want to publish a book, because it signals to people what you're working on. It's kind of staking out a claim on a certain topic. Publishing two chapters is possible, but as Linda said, the difficult thing here is if a publisher thinks that all the good stuff that you have to say is already out in an article, they're not going to want to proceed. So you want to make sure that you hold back something, and not just a little bit, for the book rather than putting it out in journal articles. One other thing to say, most people when they write a dissertation have material that they can't fit in and shouldn't fit in because it doesn't really tie in closely enough with the argument they're making in the dissertation. It always is a good idea to go back and look at that kind of thing and see whether you have the makings of an article there, or if you can combine some of that with material in the dissertation to create an article, because that way you're not just using the ideas of the dissertation, but you're broadening it out. So just those 2 points. And with that, I'll share the screen and talk about getting published, because we've talked about writing, but the reason you're doing all this, the reason you're writing, is because you need to get publications. And maybe just as a starting point, if I could ask every author that submits something to a journal that I've worked on or to the press, why did you write this? I would probably get the answer from many of them. Well, because my university has a requirement, so I've done some research and I have written this article. And I understand that. I spent 20-some years as an academic writing articles partly for that reason. But it's not the right answer for a publisher or for a journal. What a publisher really wants to hear, or an editor, is it's because you have something to say. And so you might bear that in mind, that if you're just doing this because you have to, switch it around and think, well, what do I have that I would like to communicate to people? So let's look at the publishing landscape. Everybody in the world is aiming for some of the same journals. And major journals, the Journal of Asian Studies, which is the vehicle of the Association for Asian Studies in the U.S., most of the association journals in America, the Historical Society, Association, American Historical Association, the Sociological Association, Anthropological Association, they're receiving hundreds of submissions, and they reject more than 90% of the material that comes in. And that sounds like a lot until you start looking at what happens in book publishing. And the major book publishers are rejecting 98 to 99% of the submissions they receive. And this is not because they don't want to publish things. Editors really do want to publish your material. It's simply that there is so much coming out, and the resources that a journal or a publisher have available are limited, and they have to make hard choices. Part of the problem is that every manuscript that an editor sees is unique. And so you're not saying, well, which apple is better? You're saying something like, which is better, a manuscript on literature or a manuscript on agriculture? Well, they're very different, and they could each be good in their own field. So this kind of decision is not an easy thing to do, but that's exactly what goes on with a lot of journals, and certainly with book publishers. Now with journals, I'll talk a little bit about this as we go along, but with journals, this type of decision happens with some of the big association journals. So the Journal of Asian Studies publishes material on Asia, from Northeast Asia through to South, and I think even some into West Asia. So it's not only literature versus agriculture, but it's Korea versus Pakistan. Which do you want to pick? So one thing that as an author you want to do, you're trying to write for an audience, and you have to locate that audience. And so your starting point is probably to find out what a journal or what a particular book publisher handles. If you look at the older journals, again, something like the Journal of Asian Studies, there's a tendency to focus on a geographical area. Sometimes it's an entire region like Asia, or sometimes a specific country, China, Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia. The newer journals are very often more narrowly focused. They focused on a particular subject, and that makes them somewhat easier for you to look at, because if you're writing on the subject that a journal handles, then you're already a step ahead in trying to get something published in that journal. In addition, there's something called megajournals, and megajournals, there are several of them around. They're publishing vast numbers of articles, and they will publish perhaps as much as 30,000 articles a year. The question for you is, how valuable is an article published in a mega journal? Your piece is likely to get kind of lost there, but they exist. Another thing to do, and Linda just touched on this, is to check if a journal favors a certain approach. So comparative studies in society and history, obviously if you do something comparative, that's a place you might want to look at. There are journals that are very interested in theory. There are journals that are very interested in numerical data. So you look at the kind of material that you have, and you try to find a journal that publishes the sort of thing that you want to do. and then follow the submission guidelines. And I think I mentioned this on day one, that journals will tell you what they want. And in doing that, they're also telling you something about what they don't want. So should you contact an editor before you submit a manuscript? For journal articles, the answer is no. Editors of journals discourage this sort of thing. That they provide guidelines, and that will tell you what they want. But they really expect you to complete your article and then submit it. And be sure when I say completed, I mean exactly that. Sometimes people have a draft and they kind of want some feedback on it. So they'll send something in, it's got problems, it's incomplete. Journals don't have time to provide advice on writing in that way. So when you write an article and send it off to a journal, it needs to be as complete as you can make it. For a book manuscript, the answer is yes. You definitely need to contact an editor before you submit anything. Book editors expect, and in fact they generally require, preliminary inquiries. You look at the web page for a publisher, and you'll find an acquisitions editor. The big publishers will probably have anywhere from 5 to 10. And they'll be specialized by topic. So you try to figure out which editor is right for the topic that you're handling, and you contact that person. Now, if you have picked the wrong person, don't worry about that, because the editor you contact, if it is the wrong person, will pass it along to the right person. Do not send a book manuscript unless they invite you to do it. It's just the etiquette, I guess you'd say, of publishing a book. If you do send a book manuscript that's unsolicited, they'll probably just throw it out. So how do you set about finding a journal? Well, I want to introduce you to something called Zamago. Zamago analyzes data that's provided by Scopus. If you go to the Zamago webpage, and it's listed there, but you can get there just by doing a search on Zamago, you'll find a few choices, one of which is journal rankings. So you go there, you select a subject area and a subject category. You have the option there of only seeing Web of Science journals, and I'll talk about Web of Science in a little bit. So let me show you what you're going to see if you go there. So this is Zamago Journal and Country Rank. And what you're going to see is something for subject areas, subject categories. And underneath that you could pick something like humanities, social science, and then within that field you'll have a number of subject categories. And down here at the bottom, if you want the Web of Science journals, you can click that. And so Scopus has more journals in it than the Web of Science, which is the Social Science Citation Index, the Science Citation Index, and so on. So you can cut down the number of journals that are going to turn up if you click that box. Now, Zamago has coverage of around 23,000 active journals. Of these, 7,300 are in the social sciences. If you do social sciences and limit the selection to Asiatic region, what you'll get is 272 journals. Excuse me. For arts and humanities, the total coverage is 4,500. For Asiatic region, 115. But what does Asiatic region mean? Well, it covers journals published in Asia. But there's a bit of a trick to that, because journals are classified according to where they are published. So something like the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies is edited, basically produced in Singapore, but it's published by Cambridge University Press, which of course is in the UK. So it is not counted as a journal from the Asiatic region, but as a journal from Western Europe. Okay, the Web of Science journals. If you go to the Web of Science Master Journals list, which is at this web page, you can search on words that might appear in journal titles. So if you do a search on China, which means that journals that have China in the title will be shown, you'll get 112 results. For Taiwan, 42, Vietnam, 9, and so on. Supposing you did a search on demography, you'd get 112 results, and nutrition, you'd get 265. Now, that's what you can see without registering. They offer a free registration, and with that, you can see details of the individual journals. They also offer something they call a match manuscript facility, where you enter your title, you enter your abstract, and the system will give you some recommendations of possible journals. Now, I tried that one time with something that I was working on, and frankly, what I got wasn't of much use, but it's there, it's free, so you can try that out. So this is the page that you would see, and so this is for searching journals, and this is the match manuscript arrangement. So the Web of Science, the Social Science Citation Index covers around 3,400 journals in 58 different disciplines. And that sounds like a lot, but when you start looking at them, you'll realize very quickly that most of them are irrelevant for what you're working on. The Arts and Humanities Citation Index covers more than 1,800 journals. And then they have something they call the Emerging Sources Citation Index. And that has around 7,800 titles in it. So a lot of journals that want to be in the Web of Science have applied, and because they're either recent or not well-established publications, they get put first into the Emerging Sources Citation Index. The Science Citation Index and the Science Citation Index Expanded have more than 12,000 journals, but for most people in this workshop, that's going to be irrelevant. So, if you're submitting to a journal, well, first thing you do is you follow the journal instructions. Most journals want electronic copies sent by email, and again, you send a full article electronically, and that's fine. I would not send a physical manuscript unless they ask for it, and these days they're very unlikely to do that. Now, many journals will use an automated submission system. There are two principal ones, something called Scholar One and something called Editorial Manager. Now, these are automated so that you will upload your manuscript. You'll receive a response which is generated by the computer. And then the whole process from refereeing and getting reports will be done through the automated submission system. The first thing you'd have to do is register as a contributor. Once you've done that, you'll be able to track the progress of your manuscript as it moves through the system, and then of course the reports will come that way. Now, these are quite simple to use, and I've gone to both of the relevant pages, and you'll see these kinds of steps. So the first one is that you'll be asked to explain the type of manuscript you have, put in the title, put in the abstract. Then you upload a file that has the manuscript in it. You give type into the system a series of keywords. You explain who the authors are, what institutions they belong to. Now, if there's a single author, that's you. You give your name and what your institution is. The reviewers then will be selected by the editors who are monitoring all this. And then, but you may be invited to submit possible names of reviewers. And just to say something about that, if that happens, the idea is not that you get to select the reviewers, but editors are interested in who you think would be appropriate for your paper. And also, if you're invited to say that, if there's somebody that you think should not be invited, maybe it's somebody that you disagree with strongly and you criticize very strongly in your paper, you could mention that as well. Okay, then you can make some comments, then the usual thing, you review and submit whatever information you provided. Pretty much the same story with editorial manager, with one key exception, and that's the first step, which asks you to link your ORCID ID. So I mentioned that on day one. I'll go through that on the next slide briefly. But again, article type, you attach the file, your preferences regarding review, additional information, comments, and data about the manuscript. Excuse me just a minute. Okay, so ORCID identifiers. Now, research identifiers link the work of an author. You've actually been using an identifier for your entire life, and that's your name. The problem with that identifier is that there are probably other people who have the same name, and it can create confusion. You also have some other identifiers. If you have an identity card, there's a number on that card. It's unique, but it's not something you should put out in public. Excuse me again. And you have a passport number and so on. So for authors, what you can do is create an ORCID, ORCID identifier. To do that, you go to this web page and you register. It's a very simple process, and the system there will generate an ORCID ID for you. If you're involved in a Web of Science publication, you can also get an ID there by going to this website, publoans.com. Now, there are a lot of other identifiers floating around these days. Books have always, not always, books have had identifiers for the past roughly 50 years, which are international standard book numbers. They are being assigned more identifiers, but nowadays the manuscript that you submit will be assigned an identifier. Anything that goes into Scopus, the author will be assigned a Scopus ID, and so on. But for these things, you don't apply, they're done automatically. Okay, now I want to say something very briefly about peer review. So international refereed journals will insist on a minimum of 2 reviews. Sometimes they'll get 3 or 4. And usually these are what's called double blind, which means that the reviewer doesn't know who you are and you don't know who the reviewer is. Reviewers are evaluating content, looking at your data, and they're evaluating the contribution that you make, either to the field or to capital K knowledge writ large, because ultimately what we're trying to do in the academic world is build what we know, we being the human race, I guess, know about the world. But one thing that you need to understand about peer review in international journals is that it is an adversarial process. Reviewers are expected to test for weaknesses. You're expected to challenge the arguments that you have made. The goal being to reject poor articles and improve good ones. Now, I did some work with some young authors in China, and I was talking to people in China about the review process there, and it was somewhat different. Manuscripts were sent to referees, but the purpose was they would pick a referee who was in the same field, and the general idea was that that referee would provide advice and assistance to a younger scholar and help them get published. So that was not an adversarial process. So referees are generally going to recommend one of three things, except with minor revisions: revise and resubmit, or reject. So what happens if the referees disagree? Well, what we'll always tell you is that we can call for a third report if there are just two. However, the fact of the matter is, sometimes one report is very persuasive, pointing out either a lot of strong points or a lot of really important weaknesses. And an editor might simply say, I don't think it's worth getting another report because this report convinces me that we should not or should publish the article. In any case, if you get revise and resubmit, it is a very good outcome. So why are manuscripts rejected? Well, one very important one is that there is no argument, or the argument is not supported. And the question came up during Linda's session about whether you should state your conclusion or state your argument at the beginning. And as she said, it is a kind of style choice. But bear in mind, too, that if you're dealing with an editor who's very busy, you don't want to make that editor dig too deeply to find where your argument is. But the referees' reports, the decisions about content, are not the only things that figure into a publishing decision. Editors also have other considerations. One of them is the number of articles that the journal has on hand. And a journal that publishes, let's say, 20 articles a year, if they have maybe 30 articles that are already in process or approved, they may not accept as many articles as a journal that might be running short. This is partly because it looks bad, feels wrong for a journal to delay publication for a year or a year and a half. And from the standpoint of the author, that's important too. And then there's the question of the significance of the article. This is where we come to this difference between literature and agriculture or any other topic. So if you're comparing making a decision between an article on literature and an article on agriculture, one thing you can do is say, in the field of literature, how important is the literature article? How much difference does it make, or will it make, in the way people view the subject area? And the same thing with the agriculture one. So you can possibly make a decision partly by saying, well, the agriculture article is probably more significant, so we go with that. Has the topic been covered recently? Well, this is tricky because sometimes a journal is looking for more articles on the same topic to sustain a conversation about that issue. On the other hand, sometimes a journal feels like, okay, we've published on this topic or this issue, and we have a lot of other things that we want to cover, so we're not looking for one. There's really no way an author can tell. Sorry. But well, just to give you an example, the Journal of Asian Studies publishes very little on Korean literature, but they had a pretty good piece come in, and they decided, well, because they published very little on that topic, they would handle that particular article. The managing editor told me after that they received half a dozen more articles on Korean literature, but they weren't interested in publishing a whole series of things. They just wanted to have one article that showed that they had an interest in that, and that was the end of it. So the other articles really didn't get much of a look because the journal didn't want to take up a lot of space on that topic. Is the article part of an ongoing discussion? When I was doing the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, I received a submission one time from somebody who said in an email, as I was writing this article, I realized that quite a few of the sources I used were articles published in the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. So I thought this might be a good choice for you. And he was absolutely right. We had done a series of, it wasn't a series in the sense that they all were selected at the same time. But over a period of several years, we had published quite a few pieces on this topic. So we were quite happy to keep that going. And then there's the question of how much editorial work is required. That is, how much copy editing would be involved in getting an article ready for publication. So if your manuscript is accepted, the editor will probably give you a schedule. And you should follow that schedule as closely as possible. You'll be asked to look at the journal's house style. And the journal's house style is basically looking at how the footnotes, the citations should be presented, the bibliography, and doing whatever you can to bring your piece in line with that house style. Dealing with copyright permissions. This is for photographs, for if you've brought tables in that appear in another publication, long quotations. Sometimes all of that requires that you seek permission from a copyright holder. And this is your responsibility as an author. The journal will not do that. And so finally, just remember that a published manuscript is going to be with you for life. So you want to be sure it says what you want it to say. Okay, so as you're preparing that manuscript, the first thing you want to do is check the text carefully. Because it's still a Microsoft Word document, but this is your final chance to make significant changes. Once it's been laid out, the only thing you'll be able to change is a clear mistake. So if you have the wrong date and you spot it after you have the page proofs, then yes, that can be changed. And sometimes even something slightly bigger, but you are not going to be allowed to make big changes in a manuscript after the page layout has been done. You should be ready to provide high-resolution images if you have any illustrations. You settle any copyright or permissions issues, bring it in line with the style sheet, and the editor may raise various questions. And for that, again, you want to respond promptly to whatever the editor might ask. And then you will be given page proofs. And so page proofs are the material laid out as it will look in print. And very often when people read the page proofs, they spot things that they didn't spot before. Something about changing the margins and changing the spacing from the way it looks in a manuscript and the way it's going to look in print helps people see things. So one suggestion for you is before you submit the final manuscript, reset your margins on the Word document, reset the spacing, to match as closely as you can what will appear in a journal. And read through it once that way and see if you pick up some mistakes at that stage before you send in the final manuscript. So, publishing agreements. Most journals will have authors sign an agreement authorizing publication of an article. Now, this concerns copyright. And copyright might be transferred to the journal, or the journal might ask for exclusive rights to publish the article. Back when I started, nobody was much worried about this. The journals were under copyright. People sent articles to the journals. The journal, either if they liked it, they would publish it. We didn't actually sign agreements. Nobody worried much about this. We're in a much more legalistic age now, and so the journal will probably specify what they want and ask you to sign a document about this. Now a bit of general advice. Illustrations. People often copy illustrations into a Word document, and if you do that, be sure that you're using a low-resolution image. Once in a while, I've received manuscripts where somebody's put in high-resolution images, and the size of the manuscript is massive. Sometimes so large that it's very difficult to deal with it. So be careful about that. You should be able to get low-resolution images. If you have trouble with that, find somebody that has Photoshop. And those can be copied into your Word document. But don't put high-resolution images into the document. When it comes to publication, then you will be expected to supply high-resolution images, and they should be done as JPEG files at around 300 dpi. If you create a table within a Word file, that's fine. You can leave that alone. If you have created a table in something like Excel, then you should be prepared to send the Excel file along to the editor when it's getting ready to publish it. And what you do in the manuscript for pictures that you're sending as JPEGs or for something like an Excel table, in the place in the manuscript where you want it, you put something like this. You number the file, the Excel file, as x.x, for example, table 3.1 or whatever. And then you put in the text table 3.1 about here, at the place where you want it, or picture YY about here. And that way, when they do the layout, they know that they're expected to go to a separate file and copy it into the article at that point. And a few final bits of general advice. Sloppiness, by which I mean things like typographical errors, spelling mistakes, are going to hurt your chances of success. Now, why spelling mistakes? Well, these days, Microsoft Word very helpfully puts little squiggly lines under your spelling mistakes. So if you have made mistakes and you haven't bothered to clean them up, an editor is going to think, well, look, if you don't care enough to take good care to present your manuscript nicely, then why should I care? In preparing a manuscript, people often write comments to themselves. They may show it to their colleagues who put comments in. That's very helpful. Don't leave them there. Likewise, if you've turned on track changes, accept all the changes. I don't want to see them, and I have received manuscripts when I open it, and it's just a sea of red, full of the comments and all the changes. It's very sloppy and unprofessional, and it's going to do you harm. Don't bother with fancy typefaces. Often people think, okay, I'll do a cover page where my title is and my name, and then I'll wait till the next page to begin the article. Don't do that. Just put the title, put your name, underneath that put the abstract, the keywords, and then proceed with your introduction. And finally, do not put 2 spaces after a full stop, a period, or a colon. This was something that was done with typewriters. And the reason was that typewriters used the same amount of space for everything that went onto the page, whether it was a period, the letter I, the letter N, the letter M. And that was a mechanical necessity because of the way the keys on a typewriter worked. On a computer, the programs use what's called proportional spacing. And that means the amount of space that's used by the period is different from the I, from the N, and from the M. And so it is programmed to create a proper amount of space after the period, and it will look fine. Sometimes, well, put this a bit the other way around. If these are left in, it's going to make the article look funny, and it'll be pretty obvious to anybody who knows what they're doing that you've used those 2 spaces and the journal hasn't taken them out. So I receive a lot of manuscripts where people have done this. The first thing I have to do then is to do a global change, replacing 2 spaces with 1 space. And I have, just in the blink of an eye, sometimes destroyed 1,000 or 2,000 spaces. And every time I do this, I think about the person who has typed them in. You know, somebody has sat there and hit the space bar, tap, 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 tap. And they probably have damaged their wrist by doing that. Carpal tunnel syndrome maybe, and it's just a complete waste of time and effort. So don't do that. Okay, so that's the end of the first part of what we're doing today. We'll take about a 1-minute break and then proceed with the second part.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for the first session. So we'll have a very short break for around 1 to 2 minutes. Once again, I would like to encourage all the participants, if you have questions, feel free to put that in the Q&A feature on your Zoom platform. And don't forget to mention your name and institution so we will know where you're from. And then we'll discuss more on your questions on our Q&A session after Paul's session. Thank you.
Okay, I have a lot of material left to cover, so if we can start up, I think it's probably a good idea.
Yes, Paul, please. Yeah, this is
Okay.
our second session from Paul about scholarly ethics.
When we first started doing these workshops, we didn't have anything on scholarly ethics, and at one point one of the hosts suggested this, and it really turned out to be a very good idea. So to begin with, there's the question of research ethics, and the points here are quite simple, that researchers gather personal information, and it must be used carefully or be kept private. So if you interview people, part of the interview process is going to be to collect their name, their address, their contact details, write down where the interview was conducted and what they said. Sometimes that would be not problematic, and sometimes it could be quite sensitive. So you need to be very careful. Various disciplinary associations, those for anthropologists, sociologists, and so on, have codes of conduct regarding personal information. Some universities will have an ethics committee, and some funding agencies will require submission of an ethics report. Now, the details of the rules are often complex, and so you want to pay attention to this, be cautious, and the problem is if you do a violation of ethics, it can do serious damage to your career. Now, that isn't confined to the research side, it's also the publishing side. So let's talk about ethical publishing. Fundamentally, the academic world, and certainly academic publishing, relies on the integrity of individual scholars. Authors are only able to summarize the data they collect. So in any given article, the author will have collected much more information than is provided in that piece, and will draw on that information in whatever is said. Editors cannot do fact-checking. So editors rely on authors to be conscientious. If you have an unfortunate fact that makes it seem like you might have the argument wrong, you shouldn't hide it. Readers also cannot check all the information that's provided in an article. So we depend very much on the researcher, on the author, to be forthcoming about the material that's collected and to handle it carefully and honestly. So journals and publishers do watch out for unethical research, but we simply expect researchers to be ethical. And bear in mind that if you're caught doing unethical behavior, it can destroy your career. So with that cheery note, let's talk about some unethical practices. Some of these are pretty obvious. If you make up data, if you fabricate it, there's nothing much to say about that. It's completely wrong. If you happen to find out who is doing peer review of your article, and you get in touch with that person, that is unethical. Self-plagiarism, which is reusing the same material, and not acknowledging it, is also unethical. Salami publishing is maybe not quite unethical, but it's also a bit of a violation. Salami publishing is where you take the thinnest little piece of information and turn it into an article, where you have a body of information you've collected, and you turn it into as many articles as possible, each with very little content. The reference to salami is that if you go to a delicatessen, they can cut very, very thin pieces of salami. So thin you can hold it up and just about see through it. If you have a conflict of interest and you don't report it, it's an ethical violation. This would be very unusual, but if an editor or a reviewer asks in a report that authors cite the editor's own work or the reviewer's own work, this comes very close to being an ethical violation. Now, for a reviewer, sometimes the reviewer has written something that is precisely what the author should read, and the author hasn't read it. In that case, it would be up to the reviewer to tell the editor that, let the editor make a decision. But if the reviewer is requesting this in hopes that the reviewer can get an extra citation in that way, it's definitely unethical. Occasionally somebody will submit an article to a journal and then decide, well, I can find a more prestigious place. And so after the journal has already begun processing it, the author withdraws it. Not a good idea. Occasionally somebody will get hold of an article and just outright steal it, put their own name on it and send it in. And then there's dual submission. This is where an author sends the same article to two journals at the same time, thinking, well, we'll see which one accepts it, and then I'll choose. Journals don't have a lot of resources, and if they ask referees to look at an article, then that's asking a favor, essentially, and you can only ask a limited number of favors. And so if an author does that, it's damaging to the journal. What's likely to happen is that two journals may go to the same referee and invite that person to review the article. And the person in question is likely to write back and say, well, that's funny because I just received a request from this other journal to look at the same article. If that happens, you will probably get a rejection from both journals, and they'll be very reluctant to hear from you again. There is a Committee on Publication Ethics. You can look this up online, and they have guidelines that reputable journals and publishers follow. When we talk about ethics, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is plagiarism. And most people, when they think of plagiarism, think about the theft of words, using someone else's words as your own. Now, for direct quotations, the way you get around this, you either use quotation marks, inverted commas, or you use block quotes. Block quotes where you quote several lines and you simply indent the entire quotation. And you also identify the source where you gathered the quoted material. Now, there's a doctrine in copyright law called fair use, and this is why academic works often do have fairly long quotations. Fair use doctrine says that passages can be quoted for non-profit, educational, non-commercial purposes, so long as the author and the source are identified. And so a lot of academic work relies on this. However, you're likely to find that editors prefer a very limited use of direct quotations, and they really want you to put information into your own words. And part of the reason for that is that it avoids potential copyright issues. Plagiarism, though, goes beyond the theft of words. It's also the theft of ideas. So when do you have to give a citation? Well, of course, there are things that are common knowledge. If you were to write that Joe Biden is President of the United States and give a footnote to that, it would look very silly because that's common knowledge. Factual details that are not common knowledge require a citation. Also, explanations and interpretations that are unique, that is, where an author has done a piece of research, come up with an explanation of something or an interpretation of something that is new, different. For that, you would also require a citation. And if you're in doubt, give a citation. So self-plagiarism is reusing your own material without acknowledgement. So you must acknowledge prior publication. And you have to be careful with this, because if you have signed an agreement, it's possible that reusing even your own words will violate that agreement. So this is all part of copyright. So let's just consider what that is. Literally, it means the right to copy. But it is fundamentally the exclusive legal right to intellectual property. So how do you create copyright? It's automatically created whenever you write something, when you create a work. It turns your work into a commodity. The copyright itself is a commodity because it can be sold, it can be transferred, it can be assigned. But once you've done that, then you have given away something or you've transferred something. How long does copyright last? Well, the Berne Convention, which is the master document about copyright, requires a minimum of 50 years after the death of an author. But many countries have changed that, and the standard is pretty much now 70 years after the death of an author, and that's true in Indonesia. So what happens if someone violates copyright? What happens if someone steals your work? Well, the short answer to that is probably nothing. Because no publisher wants to have their work pirated. But there really is not a great deal anyone can do about it. Piracy often happens in places where it's difficult to get a legal judgment. And in any case, doing that is going to cost a lot in legal fees. So the short answer is that if you find that somebody has plagiarized your work, there may not be very much you can do about it. But it's still important to respect copyright because your reputation could well depend on that sort of thing. So Creative Commons is an alternative to traditional copyright, and it is used in open access publications. So the Creative Commons copyright has several different versions, and I've put the most and least protective, or most and least extreme, here. So the simplest one, and the one that open access advocates call for, is attributions, which is referred to as CC BY. And that lets others distribute, remix, tweak, and build upon the work of an author. It's possible to take somebody else's work and to make money off of it, so long as there is attribution. Now, this is an important feature for the sciences because scientific progress depends on people picking up somebody's piece of research and adding to it or building on it. It doesn't work so well for the humanities and social sciences. So, in my case, what I contribute as a historian to work is not so much the data. I go to an archive and I collect information. I assemble that information. There's a lot of work in that. But other people can go to the archive, other people can collect the same information. My contribution is my interpretation, my explanation of that information. And I don't want to have other people tweaking or remixing what I've said. So in the humanities and social sciences, people often opt for the strictest of the Creative Commons copyrights, which is attribution, non-commercial, and no derivatives. So it's known as the CC, BY, NC, and D. In that case, other people can download your work and share it with others as long as they credit you. They cannot change the work in any way, and they cannot use it commercially. So, do scholars own their own work? Well, I said anything that you write, you own, and that's mostly true. The exception is if you're hired to write something or to collect data by someone else, the employer, the person who's paying you, may well hold the rights. This is a doctrine known as work for hire. Also, some universities claim ownership of everything that their faculty members create, and that's under the work for hire doctrine. Basically, the universities are saying, well, we employ this person, and therefore we ask them to do research. So the research that they do technically belongs to us. Now, for people in the humanities and social sciences, this is pretty much irrelevant, because the universities don't have any particular interest in owning what you do. They do have an interest in some of the scientific and engineering research, which potentially can be patented, licensed, and sold and make money for the university. And that's the reason that they will sometimes claim ownership of everything the faculty creates. So, as I said before, journals and publishers nowadays ask for contracts in the case of book publishers or publishing agreements. And these agreements will limit what you can do with your work. Some of them will ask you to transfer copyright. Some of them will ask you to transfer the right to publish. So you will give the publisher, the journal, exclusive right to publish your material. So how does that limit you? Well, most journals will allow you to place draft papers on your personal web page if you have one, or in a university repository. They also allow you to place drafts on a preprint server, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Most journals do not allow the uploading of postprints. Now, what is a postprint and what is a preprint? Well, the preprint is the manuscript that you have written. It's still in maybe rough form, but it hasn't been submitted anywhere. A postprint is something that an author has submitted. It has been sent by the journal for editorial changes. So it's basically in the final form, ready for publication. Now, in a few cases, some disciplines, postprints can also be posted to what are called postprint servers, but in the humanities and social sciences, generally that's not the case. And then, once an article is published, that publication becomes the version of record. And it's possible that a journal will send you a copy of that. The journal that I edit now, we do that because in the old days, what a journal would do with a publication is send off-prints. So an author might receive 25 copies of the article as an off-print. And the author would then send that out to friends, maybe send some to the dean and use it for promotion purposes. We don't do off-prints anymore. So sending the version of record is a substitute for the old system of sending off-prints. But these should not be uploaded to any place like a university repository. It shouldn't be archived. They probably should not go on your personal web page. If you want to know what the policies are followed by different journals about preprints, there's a web page here that will give you details for a very large number of journals. So you can check what the rules of the game are by going there. Okay, I mentioned a preprint server, so let's briefly talk about that. Authors upload unrefereed draft articles for comment to preprint servers. These are widely used in the sciences, and they've been particularly important over the past 2 years because people doing research on COVID wanted to get their results out as quickly as possible, make them available for comment. And publishing in a journal is likely to be a delay of several months while an article is refereed. So researchers into the virus have made wide use of preprint servers. So they'll post an article, and often you'll see a news article somewhere talking about some advance, and it will mention in that article that this is an unrefereed version or a preprint. Now, for Indonesian research, there was an archive, which the name is here, but this was closed this was closed in October of 2020, and it's been replaced by this preprint server. Now, or this online archive. I'm not sure it's entirely preprints. The problem here is it's not getting a lot of traffic. So there are approximately 1,280 articles contained in the archive. The difficulty here is that in 2020, Indonesian researchers produced 49,000 articles. So clearly the majority of articles written in Indonesia are not being placed in this server. Then there's the question of social media services, academia.edu and ResearchGate. What you need to understand here is that these are not people who are simply being generous and allowing you free access to things. These are commercial operations. They do offer free access to material posted by authors. If you put your article there, it's quite possible that you're violating a publishing agreement that you've signed with the publisher, with the journal, because of the fact that those agreements usually ask for either the copyright or exclusive right to publish to be in the hands of the journal. So if you have taken your published article and you've put it either on Academia.edu or ResearchGate, you have violated your agreement. Another thing that people don't really pay much attention to is the agreement that you sign with Academia.edu, and ResearchGate has something similar. What this says is you grant to Academia.edu a worldwide license to reproduce, prepare derivative works based upon, distribute, and otherwise use your member content. Also, you assert that you own anything you upload and are not infringing the intellectual property rights of others. Well, in fact, you are, because you don't own something if you sign an agreement passing ownership to a journal. You are infringing their intellectual property rights. You agreed to indemnify Academia.edu if there's legal action. What this means is you have told Academia.edu that you have the right to place your material there. If Academia.edu is ever sued and loses the case, their answer is going to be, all this material, we were told that the people who put it up there had the right to do that. they apparently haven't got that right. So academia.edu would require that the authors pay back any penalty. Okay, so that's a question mark, I guess, in terms of ethics. Here's something that's not a question mark at all. There's an operation called Sci-Hub that offers free access to research papers and books. Fundamentally, the papers are stolen. They've copied them illegally from however they're able to get hold of them. They get into online collections. They compromise network security. Potentially, if you tried to download something there, it could lead to some problem with your computer. They violate copyright. They amount to a threat to the viability of publishers. There's a rumor, and I have no evidence one way or the other. It's the thing is based in Kazakhstan, but there's rumor that the Russian state may have some connection with it, which I pass along simply as a rumor. And then there are predatory journals. Now, predatory journals are created to collect what's called article processing charges. These are open access journals, and open access journals often charge people for publication. I'll be talking about that in the next part of this session. But these predatory journals look like genuine scholarly journals. The titles are often rather grand, but the International Journal of Social Science or the International Journal of Humanities. They claim that they're included in prestigious indexes, that they have high impact factors. In fact, they don't have much in the way of peer review. They will publish just about anything if you pay the article processing charge. The editorial boards and physical locations are very hard to trace. So, key warning signs that a journal might be predatory. Some very reputable journals require a publication fee. Very few require a submission fee. If you look at the editorial board, you look up the people on it, and you can't find much online about them. That's a warning sign. If a publisher produces a large group of new journals and starts sending out notices, that's a warning sign. If the journal issues are not appearing on time, if the website doesn't look professional, that is, there's a lot of ads, the English usage on the website is poor, that's a warning sign. And if the journal content is different from the title, it's a sign that they just scoop up everything and publish it, then that's a warning sign. So how do you avoid them? Well, there's several things you can do. You find out if the journal is in the directory of open access publications. If the publisher is a member of the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association. Then there's a website called thinkchecksubmit.org that has lots of suggestions. There's something called Beale's List, which lists more than 1,300 predatory journals, and there's a website here for that. And there's also a journal evaluation tool, which you can find at this website at the bottom of the page. So if somebody sends you a message, especially if you've just been at a workshop or a conference, and says, oh, we saw this article and we would be very interested in publishing this. And by the way, if you have anything else to publish, we would be very interested in that. And we will get it out very quickly, within 2 weeks or within 1 month. Be very careful, because they will ask you to sign some kind of an agreement. And in that agreement, it will probably be 3 or 4 pages, very small type, the sort of thing that people don't bother to read. But somewhere in that, you will be committing yourself to pay them maybe $1,000, maybe $1,500. And that paper that you sign is a contract, and they can come after you to collect that money because you have signed a contract. Okay, so that's it for scholarly ethics. There's obviously more to be said, but that will do for now. So we'll take another short break.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we will have another very short break for 1 to 2 minutes, and then we will come to the last session from Paul Kratoska, and then we'll proceed after that with the question and answer session. And I believe some of you have already sent the question to the Q&A feature. If you still have some questions, please feel free to do so, and I'll try my best to cover everything. But yeah, if not, then don't worry, we will try to accommodate all of the unanswered questions, and we'll get back to you shortly after the conference. Okay. See you in 1 to 2 minutes.
Okay, I think I'm ready if everyone else is.
Yeah, I believe everyone is very excited to hear this third topic from you, Paul. So everyone, welcome back. This is Paul Kratoska with his last topic on issues and trends in academic publishing. Paul?
Okay, well, let's start off looking at what's happened in academic publishing over the past roughly 25 years. In 1996, publications originating from Asia were running far behind those in Western Europe and the United States. By 2020, publications from Asia are way ahead of those of Western Europe, those in the United States. In fact, they're coming close to the point of that the number of publications from Asia are equal to those, almost equal to those of Western Europe and the United States combined. The critical points were in 2006, where publications from Asia, that's this blue line here, overtook publications from the United States. And again here, where they overtook publications from Western Europe. If we look at a breakdown, we can see the figures for this. What I put here is the US, Asia, and then China, because China, of course, as you might expect, accounts for a very large proportion of publications from Asia. So in 2020, something more than half, actually, of the publications originate from Asia are coming from China. And you see the figures below for the social sciences and humanities. Now I've put the figures for Indonesia here, not because they're small, although they are, but there's been a pretty impressive jump in the numbers, but because of this. In overall publications, all subjects, Indonesia is number 5 in Asia, after China, India, Japan, and South Korea. When it comes to the social sciences, Indonesia is number 3 in Asia, after China and India. And when it comes to the arts and humanities, Indonesia is number 2 after China. So while the numbers are still a little bit on the small side, you can see something quite important happening here, which is that Indonesia is becoming a substantial contributor of material, and I think there's every prospect that Indonesian scholarship in the next 10 or 20 years is going to become more and more important. The question, though, is how widely read it's going to be. Okay, so I mentioned that Zamago tables are based on Scopus, and the journals in Scopus are primarily English language publications, and that these journals are listed according to the place of publication. So the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, while published or edited in Singapore, is counted as a Western European journal. So those figures that I've shown you above about publications from Asia actually understate the number of publications that originate with Asian authors. Okay, so now I want to say something about what I refer to as the strange business of scholarly publishing. Let's just consider a few economic facts. People who make things usually sell them for money. So if you make shoes or nails or widgets, anything, in a factory, you were probably doing that because there's a market for them and you can sell them. Well, scholars make manuscripts and they give away what they produce. People who consume things usually have to pay for them. So if you're going to consume shoes or nails or widgets or whatever it might be, you probably have to pay. But the people who consume scholarship, that is scholars, do not pay for what they use because they're part of a university system. The library makes this stuff available. Well, publishing is a business. One of the interesting things about academic publishing, which I came to realize when I was running a university press, is that you have a foot in scholarship. You're really concerned with scholarship in almost the same way that I was concerned with it when I was teaching. But it's also a business. And what you're producing, what you're manufacturing is books. So those books sit on your shelf just in the same way that a hardware store has hammers and nails sitting on their shelf. And if you're going to survive, you have to sell those things that you produce. But in academic publishing, you don't make decisions based on commercial prospects. You make the decisions on academic merit. So there's something really odd about this whole business of scholarly publishing. In fact, it's not only that authors don't receive payments for what they produce, they sometimes have to pay something to get their manuscript published. Editors of journals are generally unpaid. At most, if it's a major journal, their university might release them from some teaching time, but mostly this is volunteer work. And we rely very heavily on referees. And the reviewers that do the refereeing don't receive any payment. They provide their time, their effort, their expertise free of charge. And they don't even get any credit for it because the reviews are done anonymously. So it all sounds like almost like a charity operation. So does anyone make money from academic publishing? Well, actually the answer is yes. Commercial publishers do. For example, Elsevier, big Dutch publisher, they handle about 2,500 journals. Their revenues exceed $3 billion a year, and their profit margin runs around 35%. So somebody is making a lot of money. Where does that money come from? Well, university libraries are paying very high prices for journals. When I started out, like a lot of my colleagues, I subscribed to several journals. And those journals usually cost me something like 10 or 15 US dollars per year. Same journals today would cost usually anywhere from around, let's say around 1,000 US dollars per year. The publishers don't really have much interest in selling them to individuals. But that's the price they charge to libraries. So who writes the articles? Well, academics employed at universities write the journal articles. University staff, the academics, serve as unpaid journal editors and referees. Universities pay their salaries. So essentially, universities are buying back research produced and edited within the university system. Now, this is making universities both poor and very unhappy. So growing out of this, we have three competing publishing models. The first is the university press. The second is commercial academic presses. And the third is open access. So very briefly, the university press, the modern university press, dates from the 1870s. I know, of course, there are university presses that are older. There's Oxford and Cambridge that everyone talks about. Although there's an older, one equally old, that hardly anyone ever talks about, and that's Santo Tomas in the Philippines. But anyway, those presses generally were interested in theology and philosophy. They were not modern research university presses. So the first university to declare itself as a research university was Johns Hopkins. And it was followed by various others, big names that most of you will know. The University of Chicago was set up in 1891, and it was set up with three divisions, one of them being a university press. Johns Hopkins, though, pioneered the university press. And the idea was the kind of research that was done in a research university had no commercial value, or very little. The commercial presses wouldn't be interested. And yet, if it wasn't published, then it was not going to be worth anything, because research has to build on other research. So Johns Hopkins created a university press. Because of the nature of those presses, they were set up as not-for-profit publishing operations, companies in North America and Europe. And they concentrated on publishing monographs. Now, in the 1960s, a university press would probably print around 2,000 copies of a monograph. And roughly 1,000 copies of that would go to libraries. That would pretty much cover their costs. And the other 1,000 copies would be sold to individuals. And that would be profit. In 2020, the print runs less than 500 copies. And we're doing well to sell that. University presses price books to sell to individuals as well as libraries. There used to be a tradition of doing a hardcover library edition, which might sell for $70 or $80, followed by a paperback that would be available to individuals at maybe $15, $20, $25. And the idea was that sales would cover most of the cost of running the university press, and the university would step in and provide support as needed. And so this was the model for publishing academic work up until the late 20th century. At that point, a new model began to take shape. There were European commercial presses that began acquiring major scientific journals, and also they bought up a lot of small publishers. There was a tradition in Europe of family-owned academic presses. They were very small, they were often high quality, but the families or the individuals that were involved in them got old, and these commercial presses purchased them. So they controlled a lot of scientific journals, and they had bought up a lot of the potential competition. So they created long-term contracts with libraries to provide journals. They began reducing the print run of books, maybe 200 copies, 250 copies, and they priced these books at something like 150 or 200 US dollars per copy. They raised journal prices. So as I said, it used to be that I would pay $10 or $15. Journals these days will cost anywhere from $1,000 to as much as $20,000 per year. And they sell to university libraries. They don't have any interest in selling to individual scholars. These commercial presses are owned by large companies, and these are companies that focus on data analytics. So publishing is not all that they do. So Elsevier is part of a company called RELX, which used to be known as Reed Elsevier. Springer Nature is owned by something called the Holtzbrook Publishing Group, along with a finance company called BC Partnering. Taylor and Francis, which is the parent company of Routledge, is part of a larger company called Informa. And these are the major journal publishing operations. The 1990s brought another change, which is the computerization of publishing. So what happened in the past was that authors sent in typescripts, or even sometimes handwritten manuscripts. Then there was typesetting done, usually on a linotype machine, by the publisher. Nowadays, authors type out manuscripts on their computers. So there's no typesetting. There's only layout that has to be done by the publisher. And that's computer-based. Printing is also computer-based. So what happens is that a digital file is put into a into a printing press, and then somebody who is supervising this sets the parameters, how many pages, how many copies, and so on, and the printing press goes to work. There's now electronic distribution of ebooks and e-journals. And libraries were running out of shelf space, and there was a lot of concern about what to do with older parts of the collection. The solution to that turned out to be that libraries could acquire digital publications. They could get much larger collections than they would otherwise if they only had books available digitally. So library demand for digital publications went way up. The problem was that to do digital publishing, to distribute them, you needed a digital publishing platform. Buying the software for that was a bit expensive, but even more expensive was maintaining it. So the commercial publishers had the finances to do that, so they invested in digital platforms. Most university presses were not able to afford this. So university presses are carrying on as best they can, but they're at a great disadvantage because they don't have access to a lot of the digital world. This means that the commercial publishers have become increasingly dominant. Well, as I said, the libraries are very unhappy about this. And so the libraries have spearheaded a move in the direction of open access. The goal of open access is to provide free online access to scholarly research. And what becomes a problem with open access is that it's not free. Somebody has to pay some basic costs. But the idea of the open access movement is that you shift from payment to read. In other words, whoever is going to do the reading purchases a journal. So the journals I subscribe to, or the journals the library subscribed to, payment was made and then it was there for me to read. The new model is payment to publish. And this dates essentially from 1998. And the payment to publish takes the form of an article processing charge. The article processing charge is designed to cover costs. They range, for the most part, from $500 to $5,000 per article. The advantage in social sciences, a publisher like Cambridge University Press charges somewhere around $2,800 if you want your article to be open access. Elsevier has just introduced an article processing charge for a publication called Nature and Neuroscience of $11,390. That means that somebody submitting an article to that publication that's going to be open access has to pay Elsevier that amount of money. Now, the funding agencies are enthusiastic about open access because they don't want the research that they pay for to be put behind paywalls. So funding agencies have begun to require that any publication growing out of the research they pay for be open access. The question then is, who is going to pay these article processing charges? One idea is that the universities will pay. This might be done by saying, all right, the university is paying X amount of money for subscribing to journals. Supposing all that money was shifted over to pay for open access publishing. Another idea is that governments will pay. There'll be some kind of a program set up for government grants, or that foundations that who are paying for research will pay the article processing charges. This is all a work in progress. But there's one key problem. Way back in 2007, there was a survey done of humanities and social science journals. Within this survey, the average article length was 19 pages. The average cost per page, $526. The average cost to publish an article of that length was nearly $10,000. So the article processing charges, whether they're $500 or $5,000, don't really cover the cost of open access publishing. How do you get around that? Well, nobody's figured that one out yet. But the commercial publishers are trying. They've come up with something they call transformative agreements. Under these agreements, universities pay a fee to the publisher, which is often very large. It's something equivalent to what they're paying for journal subscriptions. And having paid that fee, then university staff at that institution can read that publisher's journals. And this university staff can publish articles as open access material in the journals offered by the publisher in question without paying any article processing charge. So there's a lot more detail to that, but there's not much point in going into it because you're not going to find these sort of transformative agreements in most of Asia. And if you're in Indonesia at an Indonesian university, I don't think you're going to have your university pay that kind of a fee. So the outcome of this could easily be that, because a lot of material is already available as open access. You can read it just by, if you discover it online, you can read it. So in the end, it could be that Southeast Asian scholars will be able to read just about everything. It's not clear at all that they'll be able to publish anything if these journals are handled under the transformative agreements. So what is the solution? Well, one thing that certainly comes to mind is that Indonesia produces more than 9,000 academic journals. It's probably too many. But many of these journals are open access. Okay, let's broaden out. In East and Southeast Asia, there are more than 40,000 academic journals. Those in East Asia are often behind paywalls, but those in Southeast Asia are very often open access. As I showed you at the beginning of this talk, Asian scholarship has become dominant in international academic publications produced in the West. So that's an obvious question. Why does Asia continue to rely on Western publications? So let's turn to citation indexes, because I don't have an answer to that question, but it's an interesting one. So I just want to say something about these. I've mentioned them before. The Clarivate Analytics Citation Indexes, 21,400 journals divided into the science, social science, arts and humanities, and then something called emerging sources and Scopus. So these citation indexes record when articles are cited in other journals. And based on that, you can get what's known as the journal, you can calculate what's known as the journal impact factor. This is based on citations of articles in other journals, usually over a 2-year period. And it's a very simple calculation. The number of citations divided by the number of articles published. So if a journal publishes 10 articles, and each article is cited once, then that's 10 divided by 10, so the impact factor will be 1. In the case of most Asian studies journals, the impact factor is something like 0.2 or 0.3, which means that most articles are not cited in that 2-year time frame. Now, you would get much better results for Asian studies journals if you did the calculation based on a 5-year period, because the impact, the number of citation rises over time for articles in the humanities and social science journals. But universities are impatient. And so a lot of universities ask for the journal impact factor based only on a 2-year period. So there's a lot of criticism of impact factors. Many articles in journals that have high impact factors are actually never cited. Also, if a journal publishes an article that attracts a very large number of citations, it will distort the results for that journal. Also, some scholars will game the system. In other words, they'll reach an agreement with their friends in the same field that they'll quote each other's work, and that increases the number of citations for them as individuals. Or especially in the sciences, some articles will list a large number of articles or authors for a single article. Sometimes you have a 5-page article and 20 or 25 authors. And what they're doing, they may have a research grant for a whole team of people, and so everything that anybody on that gets money from that grant publishes, they list the entire team. Also, scholars will cite articles that they haven't really used, again, just to provide support for another author. There are alternative measures of impact. One of them is the H index, which is the impact of an individual's work. So what can happen there is that if you've published 10 articles, then you can calculate the total impact of your work, of all 10 articles, the number of times they're cited in other publications. You could have weighted citations based on the importance of a journal where your article is published, the amount of attention an individual article has gotten, or the amount of attention an individual author has gotten. You can also do counts of the number of times an article is viewed and downloaded, the number of social media mentions, number of bookmarks for an article, and so on. And there are also some alternative citation indexes. Google Scholar has information that can be used to calculate that. There are citation indexes by individual countries. There are ASEAN and some country citation indexes in Southeast Asia. So there are alternatives, but they're not being used to any great extent. But potentially this would be a way to break the stranglehold of these citation indexes, the Scopus and the Web of Science citation indexes. Anyway, that's what I have to say to you tonight about the state of academic publishing. So with that, we're open to questions, I guess. Firman?
Well, thank you very much once again, Paul, for providing us with a highly insightful and comprehensive elaboration on all the technicalities that we need to know in order to get published, while also taking care of the ethical side of our writing, along with the very beneficial information regarding the trend and the shift of trend that has been happening in the global publishing realm at the moment. So yeah, we will move on directly to the question and answer. I have several questions here, I believe. So the first one is from, this is from Tutin from UP. So Paul, thank you for the insightful presentation. So the question is, how is the ethic of publishing a dissertation into a book? If the dissertation has been published somewhere and is available online for free, will it be considered as self-plagiarism, and will the publisher be willing to publish it? If yes, so should we rewrite the manuscript? Should we cover, should we paraphrase, develop new arguments, or something else?
Well, there are a couple of answers to that. First of all, if the publishers don't generally want to publish dissertations, and the reason is just that they are available, and the resources that go into publishing a book are substantial. Honestly, nearly every monograph that's published loses money if it's published by a university press. And if it's published by a commercial press, it still might lose money. So there has to be some really special reason to publish a book. And if a dissertation is online, there is absolutely no special reason, because people can get it online. So even without anything else, publishers generally, if they are offered a dissertation, they'll say no. The standard answer for years has been, if you can take a dissertation, let me say it slightly different. You take the information or the material in a dissertation and use it to write a book. The dissertation will contain a lot of things that don't belong in a book anyway. So there'll be, I think Linda was referring to this, there'll be a literature search that should not be in the book. There will be, the point about a dissertation is that its purpose is to demonstrate to a dissertation committee what the author has learned. It's kind of showing off what the author knows. The purpose of a book If an author uses a book to show off what they know, it's pretty worthless. The purpose of a book is to inform readers of something they don't know. And so putting in a lot of information about the relevant literature, showing that you have mastered that literature, doesn't belong in the book. So you get rid of all that. The theoretical literature likewise. A lot of the back, what you put in a book is the new information that you have found, and generally speaking, some larger argument that fits it into ongoing discussions in the field. So trying to publish a dissertation is quite difficult, and I mean, there may be, I don't know what happens in Indonesia. I have come across dissertations published dissertations in Indonesian bookstores, and there may be opportunities there that are not what I'm talking about, but certainly in international publishing, your chances of getting a dissertation published are very slim. And just to add one more thing, in North America, university libraries, use agents to sorry, just I'm getting a call from Paul Nerney actually, but they will use agents to sorry, let me just back up. Okay, so university libraries don't select books. What they do is they refer to buying agency. And so what publishers do is they submit books to this buying agency. And then the libraries will purchase books, and they'll tell the buying agency, okay, we're interested in books on anthropology of this sort. But they also tell the agency, we do not want anything that is a dissertation, because they don't want to spend money on a book that people can access for free. We might want to check what Paul Nerney wants, because I don't know if if this is something about getting into this or not. I'll send him a note saying that I'm still online, and if he wants, oops, I just called him. Just give me a second. We'll see what it's about. Yeah, I'm online. Do you have anything that is this involved with that or what?
No, it's not. I'm sorry.
Okay. Bye. Nope.
Hi, well, we're giving Paul just a second. Again, I'm Megan Hewitt, the Executive Director of APHIS, and I just want to take a minute to say hello to everyone and just take this quick second to plug our summer conference on Indonesian Studies. I'll say something again at the end because I think Paul's back with us now, but I just wanted to say hello, that I'm here, and I'm thankful that of all these questions that people are bringing to the table. I am learning so much through the questions that are being generated as well. So thank you again, Paul. It's really good to see you today. And I'll turn it back over to Firman to finish out our question session.
All right, thank you, Megan. Yeah, we'll hear more from you at the end of the session. So thanks for being here. We'll get back to you later. I'm going to go back to Paul first.
Okay, we're back in business. Let's go.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go to the second question. This is from Ni Putu Aryani from Universitas Ciputra Surabaya. I got a review from an international journal, but based on it, my professor has several main things to reorganize, including drawings and etc. So what do you advise for these conditions, since we have to state for no conflict, and of course I don't want to have any. However, we are behind the schedule for the next submission and we don't have much time to do so. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch what that first point was. You got what? What kind of response did you get?
So I think they...
no, the first thing you said there,
reorganized.
Reorganize.
Yeah, including drawings and etc.
Woo. if they didn't tell you any more than that, I don't quite know how to advise you, but just going back to what I said on the first day, if they're not happy with the organization, I would look at whether there's a statement of the argument at the beginning, statement of the argument, and an explanation of how you're going to respond to that argument. Whether the article is laid out in sections, whether there are headings to those sections, and whether as you move from one section to another, there's a logic to what you're doing. Drawings and so on, again, I don't quite know what to say, but they're obviously, drawings would illustrate the argument. So again, this is tied in with how you develop your main point.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So the next question is from Satya from Diponegoro University. So part of the question has been answered on your presentation regarding how to differentiate between predatory journal and etc. Right? But the question here is that if the international journal already has the ISSN, does it mean that they're legitimate? That's the first one. And then the second question is, journal typically do ask for publishing fee, yes or no?
You can get an you can get an ISSN fairly easily. So the fact that a journal has that doesn't tell you very much. And then as for payment, when I started, nobody paid, because that was seen as the idea that you would pay to get published was just a violation of everything that scholarship stood for. As time has passed, initially in the sciences, some of the journals began asking for fees of various sorts, sometimes because the journal or the article would require something special, some graphics or something of that sort. And then as time passed, it became a fairly standard thing for some of the science journals to request a fee. But in the humanities and social sciences, the idea was that the cost of the journal was paid for by the subscriptions. And so the authors contributed their work. They didn't get paid for it, but at least it went out and the cost was covered by the journal subscriptions. To some extent, that still happens. And I don't think very many humanities and social science journals are charging outright fees unless they're open access publications. So the point about open access is simply that no income is received by the publisher, but the publisher has expenses. And nobody can keep going without covering those expenses. So how to do this? And that's where the article processing charges come in. And those expenses, over the years I've had librarians suggest, well, it's surely almost free to produce a journal now because you don't have to print it, you don't have to store it, you don't have to mail it. But you do have quite a lot of expenses. It's got to be, there's got to be copy editing, there's got to be layout, there's got to be proofreading, and some of this is done without cost, but a lot of this costs money in the end, so that those expenses have to be paid somehow. I would say, though, that, okay, let me just say a couple more things about cost. I did a calculation one time about the cost of publishing a book. I mean, realistic costs about publishing a book. And to be honest, the charges that the big commercial presses have of, say, $150 or $200 per copy, given that they're only going to sell 300 or 400 copies, those are really realistic. And university presses are charging unrealistic prices. We're trying to hold the line to keep books affordable for individual scholars. But it's difficult because the costs in most of the world, I mean, we got by with this in Singapore because we managed to have our costs very low. And we could do this because we did layout in India, and other ways that we can operate in Singapore much more cheaply than a publisher, say, in the United States. As for journals, there are a couple of other considerations. So I edit the Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. And we don't make a lot of money, but the money we make is basically what keeps the society going. And this is an issue and a potential problem for a lot of association or society journals. The future of those is really up in the air. Okay, carry on.
All right, thank you. So next we have a question from Poppy. I think this is regarding your first half of presentation when you say about conflict of interest. So can you elaborate more on that, Paul? What does conflict of interest mean?
Well, there are lots of ways you can run afoul of a conflict of interest. If you're receiving money in some way, and this is more of a problem in the sciences, but if you're receiving money that might influence what you say in an article, and you don't reveal that, it's a clear conflict of interest. If you are a supporter of a political party and you write something that it's a piece of academic research, but it's favorable to that political party, you're potentially going to run into a conflict of interest. Because the idea of academic research is that it's neutral. And so when you have something that might influence you to say something, it needs to be revealed.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I have an interesting question here from Satyam from Diponegoro University. I think this is more towards your opinion on this matter. So academics in Indonesia have the obligations to publish in Scopus Index journals, and some universities even demand their faculty members to get published twice a year in those journals. So yeah, do you think that this obsession with Scopus is reasonable, Paul, considering that Scopus Index journals are highly competitive and English is not our first language in Indonesia?
Well, it doesn't matter what I think, does it? Because I'm not setting the requirements. What I think, though, is that the reason that universities are asking for that is that it simplifies their job in evaluating people's work, because the Scopus journals are going to have standards that evaluate the articles, refereeing and things like that, at a fairly high level. And so if you get published in a Scopus journal, then your university can look at that article and say, okay, that is a sign that that was a pretty good article. What that means is that the university administration isn't going to read the article, they're just going to rely on the fact that it's in a Scopus journal. Now, that may be a good thing, because the university administrators, even if they're academics, they may not be in your field. So, and at least in my experience, a lot of university administrators are in the sciences, and they haven't generally anyway had very much interest or sympathy for history, for example, which is what I do. So the fact that if I publish in a Scopus journal, then these engineers, well, they can look at that and they can say, okay, that's a pretty good article, it's in a Scopus journal. If it's a World of Science journal, that's even better. So it serves a purpose. But I think it's going to become more and more problematic as time passes, partly because of the issue that I was sketching out. And somewhere along the way, it seems to me that at least some of the journals in Indonesia need to be recognized. Well, they need to achieve a high standard and then be recognized as reputable publications. Getting into Scopus is one way of doing that. But it feels to me like Asia is just too reliant on these mechanisms that are centered in the West, and to some extent are based on what is done in the West. And it's a little hard to understand given the how much influence Asian scholarship now has on the scholarly world.
All right, thank you, Paul. Okay, maybe I will have to run 2 more questions for you, maybe 3. So yeah, that's the next one is going to be extension of the one that we already had regarding the dissertation versus the publication, right? So regarding to that, this is a question from Eka. So I know some doctoral students who graduated decided to embargo their dissertation in their university's digital repository after 2 or 5 years, due to avoid their dissertation cannot be published in the publication. So what do you think about this? Do you think the dissertation will still be qualified as publication material?
Partly the same answer, that even if it's embargoed, the content of a dissertation is rarely publishable without substantial rewriting. And the fact that it's been embargoed probably is helpful in the sense that it means that whatever information is in the dissertation is not going to be out there in the public. But no publisher is going to be looking around to find out whether it's embargoed or not. So that from a publisher's point of view, it's a dissertation. We don't do that. And from a library's point of view, it's a dissertation. We don't do that. And if it's embargoed for 5 years, the library will say, well, sure, but after 5 years it's available, so we still don't want to pay for a book based on a dissertation. And just to take that one step further, if you rewrite your material, if you get it published or get it accepted, you want to make sure that there's nothing in the book manuscript that will warn people it comes from a dissertation. So let's say that Professor X was your supervisor. Now you're tempted then to say, I would like to thank Professor X for supporting my dissertation research. Don't do that. You can say, I was helped in writing this book. Professor X provided me with help, and I'm grateful for that. But don't give away the fact that Professor X was your supervisor, because that's really going to damage the prospects of the book. We did a book that, it's an extraordinary book in some ways, by somebody who was supervised by a very famous anthropologist named Edmund Leach. And the author of this book, while he was doing his dissertation, had a lengthy correspondence with Leach. And the content of this is really a major contribution to the anthropological literature. But the fact that, and so it's in the book, but it's also acknowledged in the book that this was in connection with the dissertation research, and that the book is sort of based on that research. It's a brilliant book, but it's hard to sell because it says, dissertation. Well, we don't want to do that.
Okay, thank you. So there are a lot of factors surrounding the dissertation, whether it's going to be qualified to be published as a book or not.
Well, as I say, generally the answer is no. You have to rewrite, and you have to rewrite enough that it doesn't look like a dissertation in any way.
All right, thank you, Paul, for the answer. Okay,
well, sorry, I may as well editorialize just a little bit. To me, the silly thing about this is that people are writing dissertations in certain ways because that's what is expected of a dissertation. And then when they finish the dissertation, if they're academics, they get a job, and they're expected to use that dissertation to produce a book. And the question is, why is it that the dissertation isn't structured differently, so that you could have an essay about sources and theory and what have you, and then a separate piece of work, which is actually, this is the product of the research. You would be much closer to writing a book that way than having to put everything together in a dissertation and then take it all apart again afterwards to try and write a book. It's a really silly way to proceed, but that's the way the academic world is working. So there I am giving my editorial.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sure that's very beneficial for all of us. Okay, two last question, and then we'll wrap up. So the next question is from Artanti. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. First of all, what are the procedures that I should take in obtaining copyright permission to use, let's say, a photograph that I took with my camera of a page from a book that my participants use in a literacy study? Should I include information about the permission in my manuscript?
It can be hard to get this, but if you have the book, you have to go to the publisher of the book. And if it's a major publisher, if you look at their webpage, there will be somebody at that publishing house that handles rights. And so you let them know, what it is you want to reproduce. And there'll be a series of questions. Is this for a print publication, a print plus digital publication? Are you asking for world rights? You probably are. And there may be a question about whether this is for how many copies, or is it for one printing or multiple printings. But anyway, if you get through to the person handling rights, they should probably ask those questions. I would think it would be possible to get this, but you would be risking a lot if you used that kind of a page and you didn't get permission. On the other hand, you're talking about photographing that page, or scanning the page is probably better. The option might be, if you presumably have some reason for using that page, it has certain content on it. And you might have the option of, in your own words, summarizing what's on that page and why you used it, rather than trying to take a picture of it and include it in the publication. Because that would fall under fair use. You would have to acknowledge the publication, but you probably wouldn't have to get copyright approval.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. So this is to conclude our Q&A session. For the last session, I have an interesting question from Harfia, from Bryn. Hi, Paul. I'm particularly interested in the last part of your presentation when you provided, all the detailed data and numbers and whatnot. I have been truly concerned with the issue of journals, or say intellectual monetization, which I believe is connected to a greater entity like global economic or capitalist system. I just want to ask a candid question. Do you think any journal will be interested in publishing any article concerning this journal commercialization?
I think there are a lot of journals that deal with scholarly publishing. And it seems to me that an article along those lines might be of interest. There's one called Learned Publishing. There's a journal of scholarly publishing. There's some others, but those two, for starting, that would be a start. One of them, I can't remember which one. One of them is an open access journal, so you can take a look online at the kind of thing they're publishing.
All right, then. So I guess that's all for our question and answer for today. Once again, thank you very much, Paul, for your presentation and also for all of your response to the question.
Okay, well, let me just first of all say thank you to you, Furman, for you've been, I think you're an absolutely splendid, what would you call yourself, a referee, a controller of these things, and it's really wonderful to see you again. And then thank you to those who are listening to this, and my email address is on the presentations, and do feel free to get in touch if you have questions.
All right. Thank you.
And of course, as always, thank you to Megan and IFAS, and to the Social Science Research Council, and to the Henry Luce Foundation, because without them we wouldn't be here either. And I'll stop there.
Okay, No worries. You can continue if you want. We'll more than honored to have you here. But yeah, once again, thank you very much, Paul, for being with us amid this very challenging time, especially for you. We wish you all the best and all the best recovery for you. And yeah, so that's going to be the end of our last session for today. Thank you all. And yeah, if your question, for the participants, if your question has not been read by me, don't worry. We will send your questions directly to the speaker's email, and we'll share the answer with all of you later on. And a little bit of information along with a kind of reminder that after the workshop, we will post a full FAQ sheet from questions generated from during the workshop on our website at the www.ifas.org/academic writing, which will enable you to go back and check some of the questions that had been asked throughout this workshop series. But before I close this public workshop, I believe we will hear a closing remarks from Megan Hewitt, the Managing Director of IFAS. Hi, Megan. I'm gonna share my screen with Megan now.
Thank you, Firman. And thank you everyone for participating in the workshop. Especially big thanks to all of our presenters for sharing such detailed and sort of insider knowledge on the landscape of academic publishing internationally. Just to speak a little bit in summary about what we've covered this workshop and some of my reflections on the significance of the materials provided here. Our presenters have put together for you sort of a very wonderfully broad range of information, from both the granular details of the language and clarity we bring into our writing to a wider view of the larger landscape of international publication, hearing both from faculty perspectives as well as editors' perspectives. We at APHIS, and we really hope that this provides sort of greater capacity building among Indonesian scholars to be able to contribute to the international publication of works. And we really just cannot highlight enough the significance of your contributions to the global field of Indonesian studies from the variety of disciplines that you all represent. So I want to thank you for your participation here. We look forward to reading and helping to circulate your publications. Your excitement, your semangat for entering the international publication scene is palpable and refreshing. So thank you for working so hard to get your work out there to the rest of the world. I want to do one final plug of our summer conference on Indonesian studies. And while it is not a publication, it is a platform by which we offer sort of a space for Indonesian, American, and global scholars of Indonesia to share their work, to have a voice and enter into those conversations with our global colleagues. So I think we have just dropped a link into the chat, but you can also find it on the main page of our APHIS webpage, so aphis.org. You can find links to how to submit a paper abstract. And we welcome paper abstracts, panel presentations, as well as roundtable presentations. And our deadline for those submissions is going to be April 15th. April 17th, my apologies. So we really welcome your submissions, and it is an entirely virtual conference. So we really, most of the papers that are submitted are accepted. All of our participants are our presenters, and it is a gesture towards a kind of an egalitarian space of sharing our scholarship. So thank you again, Firman. Thank you to all of the presenters, to SSRC, as well as the Luce Foundation for making this possible. And with that, I'll give it over to Firman to conclude our workshop today. Thank you again.
Okay, once again, thank you very much, Megan, for your hard work. So, and for your kind remarks. So this concludes the 4-day public webinar series on academic writing for international publication. Yeah, let's give a big round of applause for all of us. It's remarkable. First, I would like to thank all of our presenters for this past 4 days. Paul Kratoska, Sida Chandra, Susan Lopez-Nerney, Linda Grove, and Paul Nerney for their professional insights and invaluable advice on academic publication. And also thank you to SSRC and IFES for organizing this workshop, especially to the amazing team, Mas Anas, Yosef, and also Meg for your work in organizing these wonderful workshops. This event would not be possible without the generous support also from the Henry Luce Foundation. And thank you also to everyone who attended the public webinars. We look forward to seeing your work published internationally. And also, again, just like what Megan said, as part of learning and growing process and applying what you learn throughout this 4 days workshop, we really hope that you will consider submitting a paper abstract to our upcoming conference on Indonesian studies to take place, which will take place in June 2022. We welcome you all to join us at the summer conference. And also, lastly, please like, follow, and subscribe to our social media or visit our website at www.ifes.org to stay tuned to the upcoming programming. So I think that's all from me. Thank you.